William C. Dietz. William C. Dietz. I swear I've heard that name before. William C. Dietz. No. No. No! Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, helping you decide, is that book worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Read it first. I have to read it first. It might be better. Resistance: The Gathering Storm is a book that was published on January 1st of 2009 and written by William C. Dietz. Let's focusing on the actual book by now. The Gathering Storm is a sequel to the first game, taking place about 4 months after the end of the first game and the first part of the second game of the Resistance franchise. Now, the plan here was to have a guest speaker come on and explain the lore of the world and what the Resistance franchise is generally about. However, I had a lot more trouble finding a guest speaker for this one because either the thoughts that I had are people who didn't really play the franchise or people who were interested but couldn't get into it enough to, serve as the lore expert here. So I'm starting to think they knew something I didn't about this book, but I'll leave the accusations to later. And with that being said, since I actually am perhaps the most familiar with this franchise than the other two, I'll just serve as your guest speaker today. Guest speaker. And continue on. So, here's your lore dump. The Resistance universe is set in an alternate universe, diverging sometime after World War I. There is some smaller lore here and there about how the world developed outside of our current reality, such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt losing the 1940 election to a Montana senator named Noah Grace. But really, the main important fact of the war that you need to know is the fact that in 1921, Russia issued a communication blackout. Nothing got in or out, and they even constructed a wall, later known as the Red Curtain, along the European border to prevent all travel. What few radio broadcasts were picked up from inside Russia's territories were just repeating a strange mantra over and over again that no one could decipher. It became clear why in December of 1949, when a strange alien menace known as the Chimera burst forth from the Red Curtain and began to overwhelm Europe. The Chimera is an alien threat, which breeds itself by releasing an alien virus down on the human population, a virus which not only deplenishes human ranks, but also twists the human form into their soldiers to help take over the planet. Now, several hints are given throughout that the Chimera not only want to take over this planet, but are actively adjusting the atmosphere to make it colder, which suits them more. Within 2 months, they wiped out most of the European countries, leaving very few survivors. After which, they dug underneath the English Channel and began their invasion of Britain in late 1950. The bulk of British forces were wiped out during the resulting invasion. This is about where the first game takes place, as the main character of the game, and of this novel, is an army ranger named Nathan Hale, who was sent over to assist Europeans with their ranger task force. Now, I'm not going to give a full breakdown of the original game, but I will move on to something else. I will move on to what happened after. After the invasion of Britain, SERPA, or the Special Research Projects Administration, began experimenting with the virus, supposedly to find a cure, although it's very heavily hinted that they were attempting to weaponize the virus to create a group of superhumans. This project became known as Project Abraham, though there were only 2 known locations where Project Abraham took place. One was an unspecified military facility in Alaska, and another was in Bryce Canyon, Utah. Out of the viral website, it is known that the only survivors were Joseph Capelli and Nathan Hale, and they were both later transferred to the Sentinel Squad Echo. After the events of Project Abraham, the soldiers who were infected with the Chimeran virus formed into an elite squad known as the Sentinels, a group of soldiers who had massive healing abilities. And that's the basic summary I can give you of the world of the Resistance. So, here's the ratings. Now, we move on to the cover, and honestly, I don't have much to say. I'm super neutral about it. Not quite like I was with the Warhammer book. You see, on the surface, the cover is perfect. You have an alien skull with 4 eyes and long, sharp teeth on the cover with a World War II soldier helmet on. Behind them, you have, what's clearly a no man's land with barbed wire and, a soldier's grave right here in the background that you can just make out. The skeletons of ruined buildings in the background, showing that not only is this at a time of war during the late 1940s, early 1950s, but it is a war that is causing massive devastation and against a threat that is not human, but was once human. This cover is very good at telling you exactly what's going on, which is probably why they used it for the first game. Yeah, the cover of the book is just the first game's cover art slapped onto a book. And that's partially why I don't have anything to say about it. I like the cover, but it was so lazy to just take this and throw it on this. Like, there is no difference. The only difference is this is smaller, so you see less of the picture than on this. There's no difference. So it comes off to me more like laziness as opposed to something actually trying to tell you about the book. And thus, that's why I'm neutral about it. It's a great cover. It's just super lazy. Now, on to the basic synopsis for the book. For those curious, I did read the synopsis directly from the back on my TBR. As usual, there will be a link up ahead. Go ahead and click that if you want to check it out. But a quick synopsis for those who just want to see it in this video. But basically, the synopsis is this. This book follows Nathan Hale and his squad of Sentinel soldiers as they deal with life and missions dealing with the Chimerian invasion of the U.S., while also detailing the idiotic plan of the U.S. president as he increases his totalitarian grip on the war, on his country as the war goes on. I guess more accurately, the main plot specifically is President Noah Grace's attempt to implement this plan, but the amount of resistance that he gets not only from some of his own staff, but later Nathan Hale, who discovers the extent of what he's doing. And really, that's the best way I can describe it. To get into the review now, because I really need to, I'm trying very hard not to go off on a tangent just from the synopsis. So I'm just going to get into the review. And to start this review, let's talk about Mass Effect Deception. Don't worry, I promise this is going to go somewhere. Now, those of you who have read Mass Effect Deception know that it's a steaming pile of horse crap that has stained the Mass Effect extended novel library immensely. It's riddled with so many plot holes that at a certain point, you have to start assuming that it was intentional and is written with such a juvenile sense of what is cool and what is edgy that it's almost teeters into so bad it's good kind of territory. I kid you not, when I say there is a scene where our antagonist is spitefully eating cereal in the protagonist's house while contemplating which potted plant he's going to pee in on the way out. And we're supposed to take that scene seriously. If that's not enough to convince you, you can thank Mass Effect Deception for the Sasuke cosplayer in Mass Effect 3 known as Kai Lang. At least how he exists within Mass Effect 3. Literally, the book was so bad that BioWare had a promise to decanonize it to help settle down the backlash the book got. Which, not to be rude or anything, but where's my decanonization, BioWare? I'm still waiting. But you gotta ask yourself, as you probably asked when I started, why am I bringing up Mass Effect Deception for a Resistance book review? Easy. They were written by the same author. See, I clocked this before I started reading this book. Actually, I knew I recognized the name when I first picked up the book because I picked it up and I read the name of the author and I'm like, that sounds familiar, but I don't know why. Now, at first, I thought this was because I also have Halo the Flood, which this book advertises. So I was thinking, okay, maybe that's just... maybe I've seen the name when I looked at my Halo collection and my mind is just connecting the two subconsciously, and that's why it feels so familiar. But I couldn't shake it. And it wasn't until after I had done my TBR video that I realized, oh no, he was the guy who wrote Mass Effect Deception. But I want to promise you guys that I went into this book with the intent of liking it. I wanted to enjoy this book because every author has their bad day. Maybe Mass Effect Deception was Dietz' version of Lair of the White Worm. It was a book that was just so bad, but it wasn't his standard. Well, after having read the book, having given it a chance, I can say I didn't walk away with a greater appreciation of the Resistance world, but a deeper dislike of this author. Mass Effect Deception was part of a franchise I loved, so I could see every little plot hole and every little twist. I had even read all the books before that. So I could see every little plot hole and every little twist that book did to a franchise I loved, and that's why it infuriated me so much. When I read this book, I didn't have a very strong attachment to the franchise. All of the stuff I told you was stuff I looked up I looked up before I read this book, so I had a basic idea what was going on just in case. And I still hated this book. To start with, the book is padded. It is more padded than that room in an insane asylum. I began to wonder at a certain point if Dietz was under a word count or page count obligation with the way he just seemed to drag things out, or the way he seemed to just throw in almost entire pages at times of useless information that isn't pertinent to the plot or even the character. Like, at a certain point, I even began to think, does this guy think he's being paid like Charles Dickens, where he's being paid by the word? Because he's not. We stopped doing that a long time ago. If for some reason, my horror warning... I forgot to change shirts. Be ready for every character that even so much brushes past our protagonist on the street to have a full description of what they look like. Be ready for every meal our characters eat to be described, none of which have any relevance to the plot. Be ready for pointless scenes and characters which contribute absolutely nothing to the book other than to stretch it out. Be ready to understand what it feels like watching a race of a snail who's been hopped up on horse tranquilizers. Warhammer lied to me, and the first 2.5 sentences of its synopsis was the majority of the book. So like I said in that review, I spent a good portion of the book thinking, when is the exciting stuff going to happen? And it was still more engaging and more enjoyable than the entirety of this book. You want a perfect example of Dietz stretching something out far longer than it needs to be? I will give you one. Pages 139 to 142. Now, the context of this scene is that Nathan Hale is looking for his adopted sister, who was caught in the part of the U.S. that has been invaded by the Chimera. Now, he was able to get to the farmhouse on an unsanctioned mission to find out if his parents and his sister survived. And he got there discovering that his parents had died, but his sister had survived along with the family dog and had escaped from the farmhouse after a battle. So he decides when he's in Detroit, I think it is, to go check out the Bureau of Displaced Persons at the Customs House. Now, the Bureau of Displaced Persons basically keeps track of everyone who's put in the the protection camps that the president has ordered throughout the entirety of the U.S. And this was to help people like in Detroit or in the areas of the U.S. that hasn't been hit yet with the Chimera invasion, discover if their family living in the areas that have been hit are still alive. Now, here's how he should have summarized this scene. 5 hours later, Nathan Hale found that his time had been wasted. The only Suzanne Farley from South Dakota that customs agent had on record was a 63-year-old woman, which either meant that Suzanne Farley he was looking for was dead, had kept her name off the registry, or hadn't made it to a protection camp yet. Instead, here's everything Dietz does instead. 1. Hale goes up to the guard and asks him if this is the place where he needs to go. 2. Hale reminds the audience that he's looking for his sister and that she is in fact an adopted family, and that his adopted family raised him because they wanted to, not because they had to. 3. Hale makes sure to complain about the Freedom First group that doesn't want to go into the protection camps and are actively protesting against President Noah Grace's increasing authoritarian grip on the U.S. 4. Hale refuses an offer to be taken to the front of the line by the guard, who wants to thank him for his service, and decides to go to the back of the line, much to the guard's warning not to. 5.
Hale goes to the back of the line. 6. While Hale is in line, he has a conversation with people who are both pessimistic about the war's outcome and optimistic about the war's outcome. Although he tries to talk to them a bit, he quickly realizes that both the pessimist and the optimist are too entrenched in either of their views that they don't want to hear his side, which is the realistic view. 7. Some women come by and start selling coffee to people in line because it's kind of cold. And when they get to him, they hand him a coffee, but they won't let him pay because they want to thank him for his service as a soldier. 8. A random doomsayer waving a Bible comes by and starts doomsaying and talking about how it's the end of the world before he's dragged off by the security. 9.
We finally get to the desk where the clerk, who never appears again after this point, his appearance is described, his name is described, and his basic attitude is described. 10. Hale mistakes the clerk's question about asking for a name by giving his name instead and starting to spell it out. However, the clerk very agitatedly tells him, no, that's not what I asked, I want the name of the person you're looking for. So then Nathan Hale gives him that name. 11. Hale and the clerk trade details back and forth as Hale continues to look for his sister. After a certain point, it's revealed that, no, I don't have your sister in there. Although there's 3 Suzanne Farleys, and the only one from South Dakota is a 63-year-old woman, your sister is not in here. 12. Hale is forced to leave because the clerk, he's not accepting the clerk's answer and keeps trying to get him to try other methods. So the clerk is so agitated, he threatens to call security on him.
There you go. Those 3 pages, that's what happens in them. None of it is of any consequence whatsoever in the grand scheme of the story. And it's a bunch of wasted time. Like, don't get me wrong. Dietz had a real opportunity here. I'm not denying that. There was a way to make effective use of these 3 pages where he's waiting in line. If Dietz was clever, he would have used this to establish the status of the U.S. during the invasion. He would have talked about, how difficult it's becoming. He would have talked about the food shortages that is currently happening. He would have talked about the increasing authoritarian nature. He would give examples of that. Maybe it wasn't that the guy was doomsaying, but it's maybe that the guy was angrily complaining about, maybe Grace's goons coming in and taking a bunch of his stuff, but his complaining is overheard by a couple officers who go over and start harassing him. Those kind of things. You could have done something with these 3 pages of Hale waiting in line, but instead, our time is wasted. None of this ever comes up. We never see any of these characters again. At most, Hale presents that the people are only seeing the war on 2 sides and aren't seeing the war in the realistic point of view that he's trying to tell them. But even then, it's not relevant because the public's perception of the war doesn't really affect anything, even though the book keeps trying to hint that it does. It doesn't even do something like it should have done, which was hint at how patriotic people are getting, how revved up people are getting to be part of the U.S. and believing in Noah Grace's speeches about how the U.S. is going to fight to every last man, woman, and child to defeat the Chimera in a military victory. To show how idiotic the President Grace's plans is in the book. Let me use that as a transition to one of the most frustrating parts of this book. If it wasn't for the years of 2016 and 2020, I would say President Noah Grace was far too dumb to ever have been elected President of the United States. And while that still kind of holds true in real life, I feel, one of the issues I found with Noah Grace is that his plan is idiotic to an extreme. Basically, his plan is something like the following. I can negotiate with them. We just need to get them talking, after all. Sir, they have no reason to negotiate with us. Everything we know about them shows that they just want to wipe us out, and they have made no attempts to reach out for us. And they're actively destroying the climate as we speak, making life unsuitable for us humans. Even if we do manage to negotiate a peace with them, we gain nothing from it. In fact, they have most of the world under their control, so even if you use the excuse that we're building up our forces in order to respond to them, they'll be able to build up the forces just as much and even better. I can negotiate with them. I have to reiterate here. Even though I summed it down, that is not an exaggeration. That is almost exactly the scene that plays out in this book. It's just, I'm not going to put you through 5 pages of uselessness to figure that out. Even the book tries to justify how stupid this plan is by saying that Noah Grace is motivated by a sense of selfishness that, is going on full display here. It still doesn't make sense because even someone with a basic common sense would realize that his plan wouldn't work. The Chimera don't want to negotiate. The Chimera aren't a group of people taking land to take land, trying to grow. They have shown no other purpose in the game franchise or even in this novel, but the sole purpose of wiping out the entire human race and terraforming the planet. So it doesn't make sense that Noah Grace believes that he can ever negotiate with them. It doesn't make sense because even if we buy the fact that he's just trying to buy time for himself, or he has the secret plan to negotiate and they leave him alive and kill everyone else, it doesn't make sense because he's still going to be killed. The goal is to kill everyone, not just some people. Even more so, the logic he uses to try and argue his way out of it being completely, to argue his way and say it's logical, doesn't make sense either. One of the things he used to justify trying to negotiate a peace is saying that just because there's a peace and the Chimera can build the forces back up, that goes both ways. He can negotiate this peace so the US can rebuild their forces and be prepared to fight the Chimera again. However, this doesn't make any sense because the Chimera control most of the world at this point. Even if this was true, even if for somehow you bought yourself a couple, decades to completely build up your forces to fight the Chimera have those same decades. They have far more land and far more resources to draw from and a far more advanced technology. You're not doing anything but dooming yourself. And it's so obvious to see that it's painful. But there are more objective issues with the book. The President Grace's plan annoyed the hell out of me, but at least it was supposed to be bad. Now, these are objective things with the book that are just flat out bad. For example, this book has a shifting third-person limited POV. Now, I have read books that have done this very well and have used it to its full advantage. However, Dietz seems to use it just, again, to pad out the book. There were several times where we switched to characters' POV, and it feels either like that Dietz is using this just to put more words on the page, or because he doesn't trust you as an audience to understand what this character is feeling and thinking through another character's point of view. One example would be Jasper, who is part of the scouting group in the beginning. Now, both Hale and his friend Kapowski, I don't know how to say it, but Hale and his friend both remark in their heads about how Jasper is the new gun. He's the green soldier in their small little group, and sentinels of a green caliber don't live to last long. We shift to Jasper's point of view long enough for him to say he's noticed that, but he plans to prove him wrong, and he dies. But he's not even the most egregious example of that specific kind of thing. My most egregious example so far is Captain Nash. Captain Nash introduced a first lieutenant? I believe he's a first lieutenant. Or maybe a captain. Yeah, I wonder. Captain Nash is a first lieutenant, guys. I'm gonna pretend I never said that. So Captain Nash is someone who's been drafted into the military. He was a physics professor at a college, and he was drafted in as a commissioned officer, but has basically no experience in the field and barely any training to speak of with how slapdash the basic training was. However, he is vital on the mission they're sending him on because they need him to identify important pieces of Chimera tech that they can use to, help advance their own forces. So when they put him on Nathan Hale's squad, it becomes a very clear tension. Captain Nash doesn't want to be on the field, but has to be. And since he's the highest ranked officer, he is in charge of the mission, despite having no experience. Now, Nash has absolutely no confidence in himself and is perfectly willing to not only let Hale and his team effectively lead, but actually kind of feels good about himself anytime he does something that Hale and the group, seem to approve of. However, there's this brief moment where Nash and another soldier have to go off by themselves while Hale and his team hold back the Chimera while he tries to find this piece of tech. And there's this whole plot where Nash gets trapped in the area he's in by a chameleon, which is like a cloaking Chimera, and is trying to get out with the tech and not die. However, it sets up a nice arc. Using his wits, his intelligence, and a fair degree of luck, Nash is able to get his gun, figure out where that Chimera is, and fire, killing it while it's still invisible and saving himself in the process. This gives him a slight confidence boost, and it seems to hint that Nash's arc of becoming a more confident leader who can lead his team in battle despite having very little experience is going to set up. So, oh yeah, you got it. They go outside and Captain Nash is immediately killed. Yeah, that's what all that amounted to. All that thing following Captain Nash, all that learning about his insecurities, all that him gaining some confidence, all of that wasted because for some reason Dietz felt he couldn't convey through Nathan Hale's perspective, even though I'm confident I could have done that. And I've never published anything, so let's get into something else. Let's talk about something I've kind of been avoiding, like the fact that the book is based on a video game. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, and before I picked this book out, I did not remember much of anything about this franchise. I played the first game to completion, although the level I remember most, I think, is the second level, and it's just kind of vague gameplay. And I remember playing the demo very frequently at Walmart, back when, they could do demos and you had to fucking snap your neck like this to look up at it. So that was the majority of my experience with, Resistance. However, as time went on, before I delved into this book, I did a quick refresher. I looked up some gameplay. I popped this into my PS3, which still works, thankfully. Played a bit of it again. And I looked up the ARG. And one thing I can say is, Dietz is back at it with not understanding characters that are already established. The number one example is Hale. The Hale in this book does not feel like the Hale in the game franchise or anything else. In fact, he almost feels like the opposite of the Hale that I looked up. Now again, I'm not speaking from a point of authority, so I want that to be clear as I make these arguments. Like a perfect example of what I can think. The Hale in canon, because I'm not considering that book canon based on what I've read, but Hale in canon not only seems to have a small problem with authority, but also will never knowingly send his men to their deaths. I remember them kind of hinting that he will never give an order to a group of men knowing they will all die in the process. Which not only is violated in this book, but it clashes so heavily with his characterization. A perfect example for me is when he takes a group of kids that he met in his old family home, which, again, was another point of padding, but let's move on. He takes these kids into one of these protection camps, which are basically, supposedly, a group of camps that are set up throughout the U.S. to protect people being displaced by the Chimeran invasion. They are nothing more than glorified internment camps that are actually worse than how internment camps were in real life. But he uses this point to complain about the Freedom First group that exists within this world, which is a group of people who refuse to be shunted off into these protection camps because, again, they see it like a prison. They're protesting the amount of authoritarian control that President Grace keeps exerting, and they would rather tough it out in the ruins of their civilizations, leading a guerrilla resistance movement against the Chimeran invaders. Nathan Hale takes the moment while he's doing this internment, while he's taking these kids into this protection camp, to complain about the Freedom First group, talking about how the reason that they're such whiners is they don't really understand what it takes to have a regimented military life, being a group of civilians who basically always had things handed to them. One, doesn't speak to Hale, but two, comes off as callous and cold-hearted, as he's also watching a line of people have their pets ripped from their arms to go be put down because they brought them with them. Which, I want to point out, didn't even happen in real life. It's actually a fascinating read. I looked this up to see if they actually did this to internment camps, and from what I found, there was no cases of this happening. There were cases of families being forced to leave their pets behind and they would die of starvation and stuff. Yes, I'm not going to say that never happened. But for the most part, anything that didn't allow pets basically told them don't even bring them. Not, if you bring them, we will take them from you, take them out back and shoot them. And even then, the internment camps still were filled with pets. There were people who would sneak their pets in. There were people who would just adopt pets from the surrounding fauna. It was just a very fascinating read. I'm going to leave a link down to the article I read down below. But it's just going to show to my point that Hale comes off as cold-hearted as he watches this needless cruelty and complains that the people who don't want to deal with it are a bunch of whiners. But strangely enough, to piggyback off this point, to piggyback off the fact that Nathan Hale is nothing like his canon counterpart, it also feels like this book wasn't really written without fans in mind. And that feels so strange. To write a book that doesn't do the character right, but also relies on you having to know this character to do it. A perfect example is in the first game. Hale mentions his mission to England several times. He mentions slight points, but never elaborates on them, never goes into detail of what he means by this. He just talks about it. Yeah, I remember when I did this in England. But anyways, let's move on. Kind of like you would tell someone who's already in on the joke. There's also the fact that this book just throws names at you and expects you to understand what they are. While it does give some description on the Chimeran forces, it just kind of throws things like Steelheads, or Furies, or Titans, or Stalkers, or Grimm's. It just throws those names at you and the creature and expects you to already have a mental picture of what they are in your head. It doesn't describe them. It doesn't talk about them. In fact, some of them are just included so it feels like Dietz can say, see, look, I put it in there. Because that Fury example literally shows up just to kill one of his soldiers and then is immediately killed afterwards. So, but this wouldn't even be so bad, except if it wasn't for the fact that Dietz spent so long focusing on benign, pointless drivel, and he could have been using it to fill people in who hadn't played the games or, like me, didn't remember playing the games. 4 out of 10. That's now 2 books heavily against Dietz. I wouldn't necessarily label this as the same kind of awful incarnate that Mass Effect Deception is, but I also acknowledge that might be because I'm not a huge part of this franchise, and I'm not in the current fandom of this franchise. I read it, and I was angered because it's a bad book, but not because it's a bad novel expansions necessarily. There were definitely points where I got frustrated because I did know how this thing was supposed to be in this world, and it wasn't like that. But that just seems to be standard for Dietz. Honestly, with 2 books against him, I'm kind of dreading reading The Flood. So, but in essence, this is just an over-padded book with virtually no flow, god-awful pace, and characters so idiotic that it's frustrating to sit them and read their plans and think to yourself, this is stupid, this is stupid, this is stupid, the entire time. So the question of whether or not it deserves Mount Doom is yes. Yeah, I legitimately cannot recommend this book to anyone. You might like this if you're a bigger fan of the franchise than I was, but you might also hate it a lot more because, again, I'm not a huge fan. I can't personally tell you how faithful it is. But given Dietz's current track history, I'm going to go ahead and go on a limb and say it's like extremely unfaithful. But even apart from that, even from a non-fan's point of view, I don't feel there's anything in this book worth reading. I didn't walk away with a greater understanding of this world. I didn't walk away with more understanding of how the characters work. I just walked away with a deeper dislike of the author who wrote it. And I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm going to. As much as I am very much disliking Dietz and his books and his writing style, do not, under any circumstance, go out and harass the man in real life. I can dislike the man's writing, but not dislike him as a person. So I don't want to see him harassed. I don't want to see him attacked for any reason. I can judge his books and not make it a personal attack. But that being said, apart from this leaving me with a greater sense of dread about eventually reading Halo the Flood, I can't say I was better for the experience of reading this book. I just hope I can get to my next book in time. I want to get to it as soon as possible. I don't want to miss anything. You know what? I should probably leave now so I can go ahead and catch the Metro. But until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. Even if it's written by some people.